February 14, 2024, Glacier National Park, Montana. Dr. Margaret Thornfield opened her cabin door expecting Valentine's Day solitude. Instead, she found a mother panther bleeding in her snow-covered garden. The cat should have attacked, should have defended her cub, should have run. Instead, she looked directly into Margaret's eyes and spoke a single word: help. Margaret hadn't heard human speech from an animal in 30 years. Not since the experiment that destroyed her career. Not since the government shut down Project Echo and buried every file. But here was proof that her work had survived. The panther knew her name, knew where to find her. And as Margaret carried the dying mother inside, she realized this wasn't a rescue mission. It was a reckoning. The animals she'd tried to save 3 decades ago had finally come home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the metal collar, ice crystals melting against the warm amber fur. FL 1994-007. The numbers blurred through her reading glasses, but she didn't need clear vision to recognize them. They were burned into her memory like a brand. The mother panther's breathing was shallow, each exhale creating small puffs of steam in the frigid air. Her golden eyes, so like Robert's had been, tracked Margaret's movements with desperate intelligence. The cub, barely larger than a house cat, pressed against its mother's belly, mewing weakly. Focus on what you can control, Margaret told herself, the same mantra that had carried her through 30 years of sleepless nights. Save them first. Process the nightmare later. She grabbed the old horse blanket from the mudroom and spread it across her hardwood floor. Her arthritis screamed as she bent to examine the panther's injuries. Infected claw marks across the left flank, severe dehydration, and what looked like tranquilizer dart wounds in various stages of healing. Someone had been drugging this animal repeatedly. The cub was worse, hypothermic, malnourished, with frost forming on its whiskers. Margaret scooped it up, ignoring the mother's warning growl, and tucked it inside her wool cardigan against her chest. The tiny heartbeat fluttered like a trapped bird. Her veterinary supplies were in the basement, but she couldn't leave them alone. Not yet. Instead, she cranked the thermostat to 80 and dragged every spare blanket from the linen closet. The mother panther watched but didn't resist as Margaret covered her with layers of down and wool. "Easy, girl," Margaret whispered, though her voice cracked. "You're safe now." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. Nothing about this was safe. Panthers didn't exist in Montana. The nearest wild population was 1,500 miles south, and yet here, one lay in her living room, wearing a collar from an expedition that had haunted her dreams for 3 decades. The cub stirred against her ribs, and Margaret felt its temperature rising slightly. Good. She moved slowly to the kitchen, one eye always on the mother, and warmed milk with a dropper of glucose. The cub latched onto the makeshift feeding tube with desperate hunger. As she fed the baby, fragments of memory clawed their way to the surface. Robert's final phone call from the Everglades, his voice tight with excitement and something else. Fear? The official report citing equipment failure. The closed casket funeral. The research data that mysteriously disappeared from the university files. And FL 1990-407. The last panther Robert had collared before he died. Margaret's phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number. Beautiful animals. Take good care of them. Her blood turned to ice water. Someone was watching. Right now. She moved to the window, keeping the curtains closed, and peered through a gap. The storm had intensified, but in the swirling snow, she caught a glimpse of red taillights disappearing down the mountain road. How long had they been parked out there? How long had they been watching her? The mother panther lifted her head, nostrils flaring. She'd caught a scent that alarmed her, the same one Margaret now detected. Cigarette smoke and motor oil, foreign to this wilderness. The big cat tried to stand, protective instincts overriding her weakness, but collapsed back onto the blankets with a soft grunt. Margaret's hands shook as she deleted the text and powered off her phone. 30 years of carefully constructed silence, and now someone was forcing her hand. But why? What did they want? The cub finished feeding and dozed against her chest, its breathing steadier now. Such an innocent creature, caught in a web of human deception it couldn't understand, just like she had been all those years ago, when the university administrators and federal investigators had made it clear that asking the wrong questions about Robert's death would end her career and worse. She'd been a coward then, choosing silence over truth. But these animals hadn't asked to be pawns in whatever game was being played. They were just trying to survive. Margaret settled into her recliner, the cub still nestled against her cardigan, and kept vigil over the sleeping mother. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in that darkness, someone waited. Someone who knew about Florida, about Robert, about the secret that had shaped every day of her life since 1994. The collar's metal clinked softly as the Panther shifted in her sleep, and Margaret caught sight of something else that made her stomach lurch. Scratched into the leather backing, barely visible beneath the accumulated grime, were two initials, R2, Robert Thorne. Her husband had marked this animal personally, and now, 3 decades after his death, she had returned. But panthers didn't live 30 years, which meant someone had kept that collar, preserved it, waited for the perfect moment to send Margaret a message she couldn't ignore. The past wasn't just walking through her door, it was hunting her. The cub's heartbeat synchronized with her own, as Margaret sat frozen in her recliner, staring at those 2 letters carved into leather by hands she'd once held, loved, mourned. R.T. Robert had always been meticulous about his field work, initialing every piece of equipment, every data sheet, every animal collar. She'd teased him about it, his obsessive need to claim ownership of his research. Now that obsession felt like a message from the grave. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself remember Robert as he'd been in their early years together. Brilliant, passionate, completely devoted to saving endangered species. They'd met at Cornell in 1978, 2 idealistic graduate students who believed science could heal the world's wounds. She'd fallen in love with his intensity first, the way he'd spend 18-hour days in the lab and still have energy to debate conservation policy over late-night coffee. Their cabin had been his dream. "Someday, Maggie," he'd said, spreading topographical maps across their tiny apartment table, "we'll have a place in real wilderness, somewhere we can study animals in their natural habitat, away from university politics and grant committees." He'd traced the borders of Glacier National Park with his finger like a prayer. She'd bought the land 6 months after his funeral, using his life insurance money. 40 acres of pine and solitude, where the only sounds were whined through branches and the occasional elk call. For 30 years, it had been her sanctuary, her place to atone for sins she could never speak aloud. The mother panther stirred, and Margaret watched her through the dim lamplight. Even injured and exhausted, she was magnificent, 120 pounds of muscle and grace, tawny coat marked with subtle rosettes. Panthers were solitary creatures by nature, fiercely protective of their young. This one had traveled impossible distances in brutal weather to reach safety. But how had she known to come here? Margaret's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where Robert's photograph sat between 2 flowering plants she'd somehow managed to keep alive all these years. African violets, his favorite. He'd filled their apartment with them, claiming the purple blooms reminded him of his grandmother's garden in Ohio. In the photo, he was grinning beside a massive oak tree in the Everglades, tan and healthy and alive. 3 days later, he'd be dead. The official story was equipment failure, a GPS malfunction that led Robert into a restricted area of the preserve where he'd encountered poachers and been killed defending a panther den. His body had been found 2 days later, mauled beyond recognition. The panther he'd died protecting was never located, but investigators found her tracking collar nearby, damaged and bloody, FL 1994207. Margaret knew the real story, though she'd never told a soul. Robert's final call had come at 2:17 a.m. on March 15, 1994. She'd memorized the timestamp from their old answering machine. His voice had been whispered, "Urgent, Maggie, it's bigger than we thought. The poaching ring, they have people inside the university, maybe fish and wildlife too. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone. The data from the breeding program, it's all compromised. They're selling locations, Maggie. Selling our animals to private collectors." The line had gone dead. She'd tried calling back for hours, but his satellite phone never answered. When the university officials came to her door 3 days later, they'd brought federal agents and carefully worded documents. Robert had been working on classified research, they explained. National security implications. His death was tragic, but asking questions would only endanger other researchers in the field. The kindest thing she could do was let him rest in peace. She'd been 26 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and terrified. So she'd signed their papers and buried her questions along with her husband. The miscarriage came 2 weeks later. Stress, the doctors said. These things happen. Margaret shifted in her chair, and the cub mewed softly in its sleep. She'd never held her own child. Never felt that complete trust, that absolute vulnerability. But sitting here with this fragile life pressed against her heart, she understood what Robert had died for, the fierce, primal need to protect innocence. Outside, an owl called through the storm, a haunting sound that always reminded her how alone she was up here. Her nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down the mountain. Cell service was spotty on good days, impossible during storms like this. She'd chosen isolation deliberately, but now it felt like a trap. The mother panther's breathing had steadied, though infection still clouded her golden eyes. Margaret had seen that look before, in her veterinary practice, the peculiar exhaustion that came from fighting multiple battles. Physical wounds healed, trauma lingered. Someone had been experimenting on this animal. The pattern of dart wounds, the stress behaviors, the way she'd traveled so far from any known population, it all pointed to captivity. But whose? And why bring her here, to the one person who'd recognize that collar? Margaret reached for the leather strap, running her fingers over Robert's carved initials. His hands had shaped these letters in some Florida field station 30 years ago, never knowing they'd become breadcrumbs leading back to his widow's door. The past wasn't just hunting her, it was coming home. The cub's whiskers twitched against Margaret's collarbone as she traced Robert's initials, and for a moment she could almost feel his presence in the room, that particular stillness he'd carried when he was working through a complex problem. He'd always said animals were honest in ways humans never learned to be. They couldn't lie about their intentions or hide their true nature behind carefully constructed facades. Margaret's fingers stilled on the collar. They couldn't lie, which meant someone else was doing the lying for them. The realization crystallized slowly, like frost forming on glass. This panther hadn't wandered here by accident. Someone had transported her, released her close enough to reach the cabin but far enough away to make it look natural. Someone who knew Margaret's history, knew she'd recognize the collar, knew she wouldn't be able to turn away an injured animal. Someone who wanted her to find it. Margaret was reaching for her phone when she heard the sound, a low rumble cutting through the storm's fury. An engine, laboring up the mountain road in conditions that should have made travel impossible. Her heart hammered against her ribs as headlights swept across her living room windows, casting moving shadows on the walls. The mother panther raised her head, ears flattened against her skull. A warning growl vibrated in her chest, barely audible but full of menace. She recognized that sound, that vehicle. Whatever was coming up Margaret's driveway, it terrified her. Margaret eased the cub into a nest of cushions and moved to the window, keeping low. Through the gap in her curtains, she watched a black SUV with government plates pull into her driveway. Its headlights died, but the engine kept running, ready for a quick departure. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged, tall, lean, wearing an expensive coat that looked absurdly formal against the wilderness backdrop. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who'd never had to ask permission for anything in his life. Margaret knew that walk. Dr. Harrison Vale, director of the National Wildlife Research Consortium, the same man who'd sat in her tiny apartment 30 years ago, explaining why Robert's death needed to stay classified, why asking questions would be unpatriotic and dangerous. He'd aged well, silver hair where there'd once been brown, but the same calculating eyes, the same political smile that never reached them. He wasn't alone. A second figure slipped from the passenger seat, moving with military precision through the snow, younger, compact, with the kind of alertness that came from professional training. Private security, Margaret realized. Or worse, they approached her front door like they owned the place. The knock came at exactly midnight, 3 sharp raps that somehow conveyed both authority and impatience. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled her cardigan tighter around the sleeping cub. The mother panther had managed to raise herself into a defensive crouch despite her injuries, placing herself between the door and Margaret's chair. "Dr. Thorne?" Vale's voice carried easily through the heavy wooden door. "We know you're awake. We've been monitoring your power consumption, your heat signatures. You've had visitors tonight, haven't you?" Margaret said nothing. In the veterinary clinic, she'd learned that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. Let them reveal their intentions first. "We're not here to cause trouble," Vale continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We just want to reclaim some property that belongs to the federal government, a collar specifically, one that's been missing from our inventory for quite some time." Their inventory? Margaret's jaw clenched. That collar had been Robert's work, his research, his blood and sweat and final moments of life. These people had no claim to it except through violence and intimidation. "I know this is difficult." Vale's voice took on a mock-sympathetic quality. "Seeing reminders of Robert's work must bring back painful memories. But that collar contains sensitive information, tracking data that could compromise ongoing operations. We need it back." The cub stirred in Margaret's arms, mewing softly. She held her breath, praying it wouldn't cry loud enough to be heard through the door. But the mother panther's ears swiveled toward the sound, and Margaret saw recognition flicker in her golden eyes. This animal knew exactly who was outside. She'd encountered them before. "Dr. Thorne." Vale's patience was wearing thin. "We can do this the easy way, or we can involve local authorities. File reports about dangerous wildlife being harbored illegally. You're harboring a federally protected species without permits, which carries serious criminal penalties. But we're reasonable people. Give us what we came for, and we'll relocate the animals to a proper facility where they can receive appropriate care." Margaret almost laughed at the euphemism, appropriate care. She'd seen what their version of care looked like: dart wounds, stress behaviors, the hollow look in the panther's eyes that spoke of captivity and experimentation. The cub's breathing had changed, becoming rapid and shallow. Fear, Margaret realized. Even at this young age, it could sense the predators beyond the door. 30 years of silence. 30 years of nightmares and guilt and carefully constructed isolation. It was ending tonight, one way or another. The only question was whether she'd face it as the coward she'd been in 1994, or as the woman Robert had believed she could become. Margaret stood up, cradling the cub against her chest, and walked toward the door where her past was waiting. Margaret's hand trembled on the door handle as she paused, listening to the whispered conversation happening just beyond the threshold. Vale's voice, sharp with irritation, should have been handled years ago. And the other man's response, barely audible: "She's seen too much. If she doesn't cooperate." The words died as footsteps crunched through snow, moving away from the door. They were repositioning, probably to watch the windows. Margaret's veterinary training kicked in. When dealing with dangerous animals, never corner them. Always leave an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. She stepped back from the door, her mind racing through possibilities. The radio in her kitchen, but the storm would block most frequencies. Her truck, buried under 3 feet of snow and blocked by their SUV anyway. The hiking trails behind her cabin led to wilderness that would kill her and the cubs in these conditions. The mother panther watched her with intelligent eyes, reading her distress. Despite her injuries, the big cat began moving toward the back of the cabin, testing each step carefully. She knew something Margaret didn't: another way out. The cub whimpered against Margaret's chest, and she realized her grip had tightened unconsciously. "Shh, baby," she whispered, forcing her arms to relax. But her heart hammered so loudly, she was certain Vale could hear it through the walls. Her landline rang. The sound cut through the cabin like a scream, making Margaret jump. 4 rings, 5. Her answering machine clicked on, and her own voice echoed through the room. "You've reached Dr. Margaret Thorne. Please leave a message." The beep seemed to last forever. "Maggie." The voice that came through the speaker made her knees buckle. Familiar, warm, impossible. "Maggie, if you're listening to this, don't trust Vale. Don't trust anyone from the consortium. Take the animals and get out. Now." The line went dead. Robert's voice. 30 years older, weathered by time and secrets, but unmistakably his. The same cadence, the same way he'd always said her name like a prayer. Margaret's vision grayed at the edges. Dead men didn't make phone calls. Dead men didn't age. Dead men didn't— The kitchen window exploded inward. Glass showered across the linoleum as a dark figure rolled through the opening, moving with practiced efficiency. Not Vale. This was the younger man, the one with military training. He came up in a crouch, weapon drawn, scanning the room. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, shielding the cub with her body. The mother panther erupted in fury, pain forgotten, launching herself at the intruder despite her injuries. Her roar shook the cabin walls, a sound of pure maternal rage that had defended cubs for millions of years. The man stumbled backward, shouting something into a radio. Margaret caught fragments. Animals are aggressive and need backup. The mother panther landed hard, her wounded leg collapsing, but she placed herself between the threat and Margaret with unwavering determination. The front door burst open, and Vale strode in like he owned the place. His expensive coat was dusted with snow, his politician's smile nowhere to be seen. In the lamplight, Margaret could finally see what 30 years had done to him, the face of a man who'd built power on other people's graves. "Magnificent creature," Vale said, studying the panther with clinical detachment, though not nearly as magnificent as her predecessor. "You remember FL 1994-07, don't you, Dr. Thorne? The original? She fought just as hard when we found her in the Everglades, protecting her mate's body." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Her mate's body. Robert hadn't been killed defending a den. He'd been the one being defended. "Touching story, really," Vale continued, signaling his companion to lower the weapon. "Young researcher discovers his project is being used to supply exotic animal dealers, threatens to expose the entire operation, gets himself killed for his principles." Vale's eyes glittered with something that might have been admiration, just like his widow is about to do. Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. The phone call. That wasn't Robert. Vale's smile returned, cold and satisfied. Smart woman. No, that was someone else entirely. Someone who's been watching you for a very long time, waiting for the right moment to reconnect. He glanced at his watch. He should be here soon, actually. Quite eager to see you again after all these years. The cub's breathing quickened against Margaret's chest, responding to her terror. She could feel its tiny heart racing in sync with her own, two lives bound together in fear. "Who?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Who's coming?" Vale tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't hear. Vehicle doors slamming, footsteps on the porch, someone else arriving through the storm. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" Vale stepped aside as the door opened again, revealing a figure Margaret had mourned for 30 years. Older, scarred, very much alive. Robert stepped into the cabin, and Margaret's world shattered completely. Nerveless fingers, landing soft among the cushions as her legs gave out completely. She slumped against the wall, staring at the impossible figure in her doorway. Robert's face mapped with 30 years of lines she'd never seen form, hair gone silver white, a scar bisecting his left cheek like a lightning strike. But his eyes, God help her, his eyes were exactly the same. "Hello, Maggie." The voice that had whispered love to her in darkness, that had called her name in dreams for 3 decades. Real. Here. Alive. "You're dead." The words scraped out of her throat like broken glass. "I buried you. I mourned you. Her voice shattered. "I lost our baby because of you." Something flickered across Robert's face. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it passed quickly, replaced by something harder. "I know. I'm sorry about the baby. I wanted to come back, but..." "But what?" Fury erupted through her shock, giving her strength to push off from the wall. "But what, Robert? I waited for you. I signed their papers, kept their secrets, destroyed my own life protecting research you were never coming back for. You don't understand." "Then make me understand." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. The mother panther, still crouched defensively despite her injuries, swung her massive head between Robert and Vale, sensing the emotional violence in the air. 30 years, Robert. 30 years of believing. You died a hero when you were... What? What were you? Vale stepped forward, enjoying the show. "Tell her, Robert. Tell her about the deal you made." Shut up. Robert's tone carried decades of accumulated hatred. Oh, but she deserves the truth, doesn't she? Vale's smile was poisonous, about how her heroic husband chose to disappear rather than face the consequences of his discoveries, about how he's been living comfortably in witness protection while she rotted away in guilt. Margaret felt the world tilt. Witness protection. Robert's jaw clenched. It wasn't supposed to be forever. The poaching ring had connections everywhere. Universities, federal agencies, even local law enforcement. If I'd stayed, if I'd tried to expose them through normal channels, we'd both be dead. You let me think you were dead instead. Each word felt like swallowing razors. You let me grieve. Let me blame myself. Let me... She thought of the miscarriage, the years of isolation, the slow poison of secrets she'd carried. You let me waste my entire life. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret could see it now. The calculation behind his decision, the cold mathematics of survival that had weighed her suffering against his safety and found her wanting. If you'd loved me, you would have trusted me. If you'd loved me, you would have found another way. The cub mewed plaintively from the cushions, and Margaret realized she'd been shouting. Her hands shook as she gathered the tiny creature back into her arms, kneading its warmth against the ice spreading through her chest. The panther collar, she said, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. You had them bring her to me. Why? Some twisted form of guilt? Because we need your help. Robert's voice turned pleading. The operation never ended, Maggie. They just got better at hiding it. Vale's been running endangered species to private collectors for decades, using government resources, falsifying research data. But we finally have evidence. We? There are others. Researchers who've been gathering proof, building a case. But Vale's too connected, too protected. We need someone on the inside, someone with your reputation, your credentials. Someone expendable. The truth was bitter on her tongue. Margaret looked at Vale, who was watching the exchange with predatory patience. That's what this is, isn't it? Robert needs a martyr for his cause, and his guilt-ridden widow is the perfect candidate. It's not like that, isn't it? Margaret's laugh was broken glass. 30 years too late. You show up asking me to risk everything for secrets you should have trusted me with from the beginning, and if I die in the process, well... She met Robert's eyes, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. At least you'll finally be free of the loose end I represent. The mother panther made a sound deep in her throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Recognition. This magnificent creature had been used too, manipulated and transported and delivered to serve someone else's agenda. But unlike Margaret, she'd never stopped fighting. The difference between us, Margaret whispered to the panther, is that you never forgot who the real predators were. Vale clapped slowly, mockingly, touching reunion. But we're on a schedule here. Dr. Thorne, you have two choices. Help us close this case quietly or become part of the evidence we need to disappear. Margaret looked at the cub in her arms, then at its wounded mother, then at the two men who'd shaped her life through lies and absence. She'd spent 30 years paying for someone else's choices. That ended now. Margaret's hands stilled on the cub's trembling form as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The timing of the storm, the convenient breakdown of the panther's tranquilizer, the way Vale had arrived knowing exactly what he'd find. You orchestrated all of this, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the cabin's tension like a blade. The panther wasn't escaping, she was being delivered. The storm wasn't bad luck, it was cover. And Robert... She looked at her supposedly dead husband with dawning horror. You've been working with Vale all along. Robert's face went white. Maggie, no. The phone call warning me not to trust Vale. Classic misdirection. Margaret's mind raced through 30 years of carefully constructed lies, seeing them now with brutal clarity. Make me think you're the hero riding to my rescue when really you're just another one of his assets. You don't understand the complexity. I understand perfectly. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. You needed someone to take the fall for this operation, didn't you? Someone with enough credibility to make the exposure look authentic, but expendable enough that losing them wouldn't matter. Your grieving widow still carrying guilt over secrets she thought she was protecting. She laughed, a sound devoid of humor. God, I was perfect for it. Isolated, guilty, desperate for redemption. You probably counted on me being grateful just to see you alive. Vale's predatory smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected her to piece it together this quickly. The beautiful irony, Margaret continued, is that you actually did die in Florida, didn't you? The Robert F's married, the man who believed in something bigger than himself. He's been dead for 30 years. What came back is just another predator wearing his face. Robert stepped forward, desperation creeping into his voice. I did what I had to do to survive, to bring down the real criminals by becoming one. Margaret's words hit him like physical blows. Tell me, Robert, how many endangered animals have died while you were building your case? How many researchers have been silenced while you stayed safely hidden? How many people like me have you fed to Vale's machine? The mother Panther struggled to her feet, placing herself protectively near Margaret's chair. Despite her injuries, despite everything that had been done to her, she recognized something in Margaret's voice that Robert had missed entirely, the sound of a predator finally showing her claws. You want to know the real tragedy? Margaret's eyes never left Robert's face. I would have helped you 30 years ago. If you'd trusted me with the truth, if you'd asked me to run with you or fight beside you, I would have done it without hesitation. Because I loved you. I was trying to protect. You were trying to control. The words came out flat, final. Just like now, show up with some elaborate manipulation, pull at my guilt and grief, and expect me to dance to whatever tune serves your purpose. She shook her head slowly. But I'm not the broken woman you left behind, Robert. That woman died when she finally stopped waiting for you to come home. Vale shifted impatiently. Enough theatrics. Dr. Thorne, you're going to help us whether... No. Margaret's interruption was quiet but absolute. I'm not. You don't have a choice. There's always a choice. Margaret looked down at the cub in her arms, this innocent creature that had been dragged into their web of lies and manipulation. You made yours 30 years ago, Robert. You chose to disappear rather than fight. You chose to let me suffer rather than trust me with the truth. You chose to become the very thing you once stood against. She stood up, cradling the cub carefully, and walked to where the mother panther waited. The magnificent animal watched her approach without fear, recognizing something fundamental, not another predator, but an ally. But I'm making a different choice. Margaret's voice carried a strength that surprised even her. I'm choosing to fight. Vale's hand moved toward his jacket. I wouldn't advise. What? Violence? Margaret's laugh was sharp as winter wind. Against a 73-year-old woman and 2 wounded animals? How does that play in your carefully constructed narrative, Dr. Vale? How does that serve your need for a credible fall guy? The truth hit Vale like a slap. His entire plan depended on Margaret's willing cooperation, on her desperation making her compliant. A martyred whistleblower was useful. A murdered elderly woman was just messy. You see, Margaret continued, her confidence growing as she watched uncertainty creep into their faces, you needed my reputation intact, my credibility unquestionable. But the moment you resort to force, you destroy the very thing that made me valuable to you. Robert's voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion. Maggie, please, these people will kill us all if we don't give them what they want. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man she'd loved but a stranger wearing his face, someone who'd spent so long hiding that he'd forgotten how to stand up. Then we die fighting, she said simply. Like we should have 30 years ago.